Hey everyone, my name is Josh Brothheim and I'm going to be leading today's training. So why don't we just go ahead and get started here? Yeah, it's a couple minutes in already. So welcome everybody, and today we're going to be doing the Sumo Administration Certification class. So hopefully you've taken a class with us before. Today is going to be very similar. We're going to have 3 hours set aside for today. The first 2 hours, or probably closer to about an hour and a half, will be presentation, demonstration, slides, that kind of stuff. And then we've set aside an hour at the end for you guys to take the exam. So the administration exam, like the other exams, is an open book exam, open Google, open help, and it's an opportunity for you to kind of prove that you know about the administration side of Sumo Logic. So let's go ahead and dive in. Today is going to be a little slide heavy. I apologize for that, but there's a lot of concepts that we really want to discuss. I will certainly go into the application to show things, but the first half hour or so is a little death by PowerPoint. So, but hopefully it's still useful. I will be sending out the slides as well at the end. So once this concludes, we'll send out an email to you guys, like a feedback form, and it should have the links to the slides and the recording as well, actually, while both. So, all right, so let's dive in here. If there's any questions as well, I should have mentioned that, go ahead and put them in the chat. So I'll try to check that periodically. Getting ahead of myself. And I'll try to answer those questions. So feel free to put them in there. I just have everybody muted just due to the attendance. So what are we going to be talking about for the next hour and a half or so? Well, these are the 5 points, and actually we have some more, but what we're going to talk about first is data collection strategy. So as we'll discuss, and as you're probably aware, your data is out there in the world. You need to bring it into Sumo Logic. How's that going to happen? Well, we're about to discuss ways that it will happen, recommendations on different environments to make sure things run smoothly. We're going to talk about best practices around data collection as well. So giving you some of our experience and what we've seen, and encouraging you to use certain things. We'll talk about a robust naming convention for your metadata. And specifically, we'll talk about source categories, why they're helpful, why they're important, why they're good for your users, and can solve a lot of labeling issues. So if you're not familiar with those yet, which you probably are at this point, we'll certainly go into those deeper. We'll talk about sharing and recommending searches and dashboards. Sharing of searches and dashboards should not be new, but the recommendation feature that we have is sort of newish, that I think will help direct people to the right area. So we'll go over that kind of quickly, but still point it out. And then we'll talk about some optimization tools that can help with search performance. Some things that we'll encourage you to use right away, some things that we just want you to know kind of theoretically or what they do, and then you can decide when to implement them. All right, cool. So this first slide you may have seen before, but we're going to be concentrating on one specific portion of it today. So what this slide is attempting to show is Sumo Logic data flow. And so what we have in the first step, and what we're going to be doing right now, is talking about how to get your data in Sumo Logic. So right now your data is out there in the world. It might be in the cloud, it might be in a server farm, it might be on a computer in the office, it might be on your laptop, and probably 100 other different places. And so in order for Sumo Logic to help you with that data, we need to get that data, and it needs to be collected and brought into Sumo Logic. And that's what we're going to be talking about right now, is how that occurs and different options. Step 2 is then you have your data sitting in Sumo Logic, and now you need to do something with it. And so that's where you would start to use the operators to slice and dice your data, use the charts to express your data in kind of a graphical form, rather than just looking at raw numbers or even raw log messages. And then visualizing and monitoring, where you can use those alerts and dashboards to know what's going on in your environment. Even if you're not aware of Sumo Logic, you could still have a big screen in your office or command center that has a dashboard showing things going up or things going down, and hopefully going the direction you want them to. So let's go ahead and get into this data collection a little bit more. Now, enterprise logs are everywhere. I don't think that's really a big surprise to you guys. You've probably used many of these organizations' services, and there's a lot of certainly new ones on here. The slide's a lot of data already. And what we're just trying to express here is, those logs are all over, and we can assist you with them. They might be logs generated from security devices. They might be logs associated with databases. With Sumo Logic, we basically say if a human can read it, we can help you understand it. So I want to highlight that, but I think we're all aware of the capabilities of Sumo. Now, this is the first slide where we'll start to dig into collectors. And what we're showing with this slide is the fact that at the top of it, top center, we have the Sumo Logic cloud. So that's where the data all needs to arrive to. But where that data comes from and how it gets there is going to vary a little bit. Same theory, but it will change a little bit. So let's go ahead and talk about the left-hand side of the screen first. On the left-hand side of the screen, we have, it sounds odd to say this, but these are older technologies at this point. Things that are sitting behind firewalls that are generating local files, host metrics, syslog data, etc. And so in order for Sumo Logic to help you with that, we need to get that data collected and brought into Sumo Logic. And to do so, you're going to use what we call an installed collector. An installed collector, as the name hopefully implies a little bit, is going to be a collector that will be installed somewhere in your environment, which is going to basically grab the data, send it over to Sumo Logic. So that's one option, and we'll certainly talk about it in more detail, but at a high level, that's what that would be doing. On the right-hand side of the screen, you have your newer technologies, the cloud properties, AWS, Azure, GCP, etc. And once again, the data needs to be collected and brought to Sumo Logic. But with those environments, there's not a place to install a collector, physical or at least a software location for it. So what we do is, or what we allow you to do is use what we call a hosted collector, where essentially you will just go into our UI and say, this is the service I want to use, let's say AWS. These are my key role account information, essentially username and password. And then on your behalf, we go ahead and grab that data and bring it into Sumo Logic. So it's the same end result of data being collected and brought to Sumo Logic. It's just, do you want the system, our system to do it with the cloud, or do you want to actually install a collector somewhere and have that grab data? And we'll talk about the pros and cons of both of those in a moment. So there's three collector deployment options. You'll notice on the previous slide, I said there was two. There was an installed collector and a hosted collector. In actuality, there's three, where the installed collector has two different flavors, if you will. It's the same collector, the same executable, same app, all that. It's just from a methodology or an architectural standpoint, where do you put it? So once again, on the left-hand side of the screen, we have the hosted collectors, and that's, as I described, the data is in the cloud. You want to bring it to the Sumo cloud, and you would install or actually utilize a collector that we host or for you, essentially, because it's a hosted collector. Then we grab that data on your behalf. So that's really simple to do. The right side, it's a little trickier. Not really, I mean, not trickier, but just a little more goes into it. Because what we're trying to show here on the right-hand side of the screen are two different methods of using installed collectors. The first one on the top right is the idea of having a bunch of different machines generate log data, and then having that log data sent to as it says here, a centralized data collection and a specific device or machine that's using the Sumo collector to send to Sumo, and then takes all that data and sends it over on your behalf. So in this case, it's like almost a one-to-many, where you can have many machines creating data. It would send it to one collector, or you could have multiple collectors, but less, and then that would send to the cloud. And we'll talk about why that's good in a second. On the bottom, though, you have the install collector, where essentially each device would have their own collector installed on it. So, and that's more like a one-to-one ratio. So the options you're going to have are, do you want to install the collector in a centralized location, or do you want to install it on each machine, or both? And we'll talk about, like I said, the pros and cons right about now. So this slide with collector considerations, I don't want you to get too bogged down on the details of it. But what I want to express here is that you may need to install multiple collectors if you reach certain or meet certain criteria. So like I said, the numbers I'm not concerned you knowing, but if, for example, you're going to have a lot of combined files coming in this case, more than 500, you may need to install more than one collector. If you're going to be capturing logging traffic for more than 15,000 events per second, you may need multiple collectors. And certainly as you grow, as your devices are maybe geographically separated, you may want to have multiple collectors. So just as many of our customers have multiple collectors. Many of our customers have hundreds of collectors, thousands of collectors. We have some customers that have 10,000 collectors. So having them, is great to bring your data in, but we just want to encourage you to view the options you have, and let's talk about those right now, when to use multiple, and the options you have around just the collector kind of scenarios, as we call them. So the first one is local data collection. And so what's happening here is the collector is, as it says on the top, the collector is going to be installed on the target host, and then it's going to send that log data that's produced by those target hosts directly to the Sumo Logic backend via HTTPS connection, so a secure connection. The source types that we see typically occurring for this type of usage of the collector are local files, Windows events, Docker, syslog data, etc. Now, the benefit here is there's no hardware requirement and automation is easy to do. So if you're using something like Chef or Puppet for scripting, it's very easy to basically say on all new devices or new systems or environments, install the collector automatically so that you can handle that very easily, very seamlessly. Now, in this case, the drawback is the outbound internet access is required. So as I showed on, this previous slide, this is where you would be using the install collector here. And essentially each device would have their own collector. And then each collector would need to call out to the Sumo Logic cloud. And then essentially those devices or that wherever that collector is installed is exposing itself to the internet. Now, it's not a in and out. It's not exposing your device to all network traffic coming in, but it is essentially opening it up to a port and an IP address that we can provide, which some customers don't feel comfortable doing. And we certainly agree with that. For certain environments, you don't want to do that. So that is one of the drawbacks of this method. And then there would be resource usage on the target. The typical scenario that we see this use case, though, is where customers have large amounts of orchestration or automation going on. So on-prem data centers is most common. Now, the centralized data collection is very similar, but in this case, the collector is going to be installed on a dedicated machine or a set of dedicated machines, just depending on how large the organization is, that are going to collect the log data from those target hosts and then forward the data to the Sumo Logic backend. So essentially, the centralized data collection is acting like a middleman or almost a router, if you will. So the benefit here is there's not going to be any outbound internet access required on those devices because the collector will just grab those logs internally and then send them to the internet or out through the internet on your behalf. You can leverage your existing logging infrastructure, which is helpful here as well. Now, the drawbacks, scale, dedicated hardware, and complexity, they all kind of go together, and they're not impossibilities to overcome by any means, but they are things you want to consider. So with scale, for example, so let's say you start off and you have 10 collectors and you grow 100x. Now, that doesn't mean you're necessarily going to need 100x collectors, but you potentially could need more. And so that's just something you'll want to think about and maybe plan ahead for. Dedicated hardware. So you're going to have a dedicated machine or a dedicated group of machines, depending on how you do it, that are going to have the collector installed and are going to be transferring logs from your environment to us. Well, what if that device goes down? Well, that's going to be a problem because if you have any other hardware or anything else on there, that would kill that connection. And so that is where some complexity comes in regarding failover. So if that does happen, what do you do? Well, you can certainly install another collector that can get stood up in the case that one goes down, but that does add complexity. You do need to consider it. So just things to keep in mind. Typical scenarios we see here are customers, mostly Windows environments, or that they have that existing logging infrastructure. And the last one, cloud data collection, is kind of the most not to say obvious, but the name kind of implies what it's doing. So this is going to be helpful where the data is generated in the cloud and then is going to be collected via the Sumo Logic cloud integration, as we call it, or essentially the hosted collector. The source types of data that you're going to see that are most common are, well, cloud data, S3 bucket data, HTTPS data, Google O365 data. Big benefit here, no software installations needed. So that's really a big driver. So if you're a customer using cloud infrastructure, using cloud data collection is just going to make sense. And as I mentioned, many customers use multiple versions. So you might grab your AWS data using a cloud collector. You might use a installed collector to grab some of your, I don't think something internal, Apache logs or whatever it might be. And so customers have a hybrid. It's not rare to have just use cloud data collection, but just depends on your organization. So metadata. So a little tangent here, but an important topic. So what is metadata? Metadata itself is not a Sumo Logic thing, so you may have used it in other places, but we certainly use it and want you to take advantage of it. So what we're doing here is we're saying when the data comes in, certain tags are going to be associated with that data. In this case, we're going to talk about log messages specifically. So by default, the top 4 items on this list, the ones not in bold, get applied to your data. So the name of the collector, your source host, your source name, etc. I mean, you can see the list right there. Now, for example, with the collector, is that going to be a good way for you to locate your data? Well, I don't know, but it may not be, because typically the collector name will be a computer name, especially as you start to roll this out to 100, 1,000, 10,000 different devices. Naming, becomes harder to do. And so what can happen is when you ingest your data, you might have data from your Apache environments come from collector 9481 and collector 4324. And your O365 data comes from collector 4417. I'm just making up numbers, of course. Now, when your users go to search for that data, are they going to remember that, hey, oh yeah, collector 4482 has this data, but collector 8449 has that clean way to locate your data? And so what we created is what we call source category, which is a freely configurable comes in, you can say this type of data has this source category. And the source category, I actually should have an example on the screen, so I apologize I don't. You'll see one on the next screen. Actually, yeah, let's go to the next screen. So here, for example, we have source categories, and we'll use this top left box. So this top item, the source category here, I have prod, myapp1, apache/access. And what this tells me by using the source category very clearly, even if I don't know my data, is this is going to be production data versus development data versus lab data versus sandbox data. It's telling me the environment. It's telling me it's associated with myapp1 versus myapp2 versus it's telling me that information. And then it's specifically telling me it's Apache data, and even more specifically telling me it's Apache access data versus Apache error data. So it's starting to tell me environment. And so this is easier to read, and I can also use, well, we'll talk about wildcards and search ahead in a moment, but I can start to understand my location of my data in more of a folder structure, if you will, or directory structure or a tree structure, where at the top level you would have your environment, at the sub level you'd have your app type, and so on and so forth. And we'll talk about those components in a few moments. But so what you can do is you can start to use these components, and they don't have to have the same amount of levels. So here, for example, I have prod myapp1 CloudTrail, which is referring to our CloudTrail data associated with myapp1 in the production environment. Well, down here I have prod myapp2 Tomcat Catalina out. And so it's still telling me where my data is, but it's just going a little bit deeper. So it's telling me there's my production data associated with my app2, associated with Tomcat, and then those Catalina/out directories, if you will, that house that data. All right, so why is source categories good? I mean, I certainly told you to use them, but let me prove it to you that these can be helpful. So these are 3 places where they're helpful. There's actually a couple more here and there, but these are good places to start. So simple search scoping is a reason to use source categories. Because by doing so, if you did not have these source categories, as I just described, you might have to use the collector name. So you might have to say, if I want to look at the production Apache data, rather than doing prod myapp1 Apache like I've done here on this first line, you would have to do, hey, show me data from collector 9421 and collector 8433, and this whole list, and it can be very difficult to know that. And with the wildcards, now I can start to segment out what data I want in that folder kind of tree hierarchy, but I can adjust the almost the root level, if you will. So in this second line here, I'm saying, grab my app1 Apache data, but I'm putting a wildcard at the front. So I'm basically saying, grab my production data, grab my lab data, grab my dev data, whatever environments I've set up. And so these wildcards make it a lot easier for me to control what I want to see versus using a collector name or some other name that might not be as specific. Source categories are going to help you with partitions or indexes. Now, we haven't talked about indexes yet, so telling you that it helps with that might not be a great selling point, but we'll talk about indexes or specifically partitions later. But at a high level, you have the ability to start to group your data together. And by using source categories, you can group together the data based on these customized source categories you create, excuse me. So this is how you can say, all right, put my data from my app1, my production data from my app1 in one bucket, put my production data from my app2 in another bucket. And then when you want to query against those, you would go to one bucket or the other. And we'll talk about, like I said, the partitions benefit of doing that in a moment, but that's certainly a big help. And then you can start to use these source categories for RBAC roles. So we have the idea of RBAC. We'll talk about it shortly. Role-based access control, not really new to Sumo logic, or new to us. We added it recently, but not really new to the world. But what it allows you to do is start to control where your users are querying against. So with this source category, for example, I could say I want my users or a specific group of users to only access production MyApp1 data. They can access production MyApp1 Apache data. They can access product MyApp1 Tomcat data or O365 data, but they can't access prod MyApp2 data. They can't even access dev MyApp1 data. They're very locked down to what they're doing. So if you have data that you want to segment out where you don't want everybody looking at it for whatever reason, this is a very simple way to do so. So what are you going to name those components of the source category? Well, I mean, it's up to you to decide, but these are some suggestions what we've seen are popular. Environment is a great one. So if you're going to be ingesting data for different environments within Sumo Logic or into Sumo Logic, you would probably want to do one for production, one for UAT, one for dev, one for sandbox, and whatever you have. If you only are going to have production data coming into Sumo Logic and never have any plans to bring in any other type of environment data like UAT or QA, then having the environment or component of prod probably doesn't make sense because it's all production data. Application name, certainly specifying the MyApp1 versus MyApp2. Geographic information. Do you want to separate your data from your East Coast data center from your West Coast data center, or office location or region or what have you? Maybe, maybe not. It's, you know, you could certainly understand why it'd be helpful, but in some environments you just don't need that specifics. AWS region, you know, kind of goes a little bit with geographic region. Well, if you're not using AWS, probably making a component by AWS region is not really going to make sense. And then business unit. Maybe you want to split up your sales data from your eng data, from your development data. You can start to do so. We do encourage you to create the higher level components and that are going to, excuse me, let me take that one more time. So we encourage you to take the data that's going to be searched most often and place that as a higher level component. So if you envision it like a folder structure where, you know, you have your root C drive, and then under there you have your programs, and then so on and so forth, we would encourage a similar plan for labeling your data. Now, that's maybe easier said than done. So we would encourage you to, you know, plan ahead with a naming convention. One thing about source categories is that when you apply the name to your data, the source category is not retroactive. So if I I start ingesting data with a certain source category, and then I realize, oh, you know what, I should change my naming convention, that naming convention will only help with new data that comes in. The old data would still have that old name. Now, that's not bad. I mean, you would just need to search against two different source categories at the same time, or limit your search to only recent data or what have you, but just something I want you to keep in mind. Now, we also can ingest metrics. You may know us as a log analytics company, and that's what we grew up as, but we handle metrics perfectly fine. And what I want to show with this slide and the next slide is similar to, you have your logs all over the place, you have your metrics all over the place, and we can help you with them. So you might have host metrics that are sitting on a laptop or a personal device where you want to keep track of that type of information. You can bring that into Sumo Logic. You might have AWS metrics like CloudWatch. You can certainly bring those in. And you might have graphic compatible data, such as things that are being generated by DropWizard or CollectD or StatsD. And so those can all be brought into Sumo Logic. Yeah, so then that's really it for, oops, sorry, my mouth is going a little crazy. So that's really all for ingesting metrics. Just want to, let you know that can occur, and to bring them in is quite easy. You can even use the same collector to bring in logs and metrics at the same time. In fact, we have a lab, we won't do it today, although I might run through it quickly, that we do that, where you will install a collector, you'll bring in some log data from your device, you'll bring in some metrics data from your device, and you'll see it in Sumo Logic. So I'll talk about the lab certainly, because I do encourage you to do them. They're not relevant for the test, so you can still take the exam without doing them, but I'll point them out because they are kind of, I was going to say cool. I don't know how cool collectors can be, but they are kind of interesting at least. All right, sharing and recommending searches and dashboards. Quick slide here. Because sharing searches and dashboards should not be new. Hopefully you've know the benefit of that. You've experienced that in one of our other classes. And if you haven't, it's very simply, if you take the time to create a query or a dashboard, Well, we'd encourage you to share it with your organization or your team or somebody, because there's somebody else who can probably benefit from that. Maybe they can take that query that you created and use it right away, and maybe you save them, 15 minutes of time, which is great. Or maybe they can take the query that you created and modify it a little bit. So use yours as kind of a template and tweak it for their own needs, which saves them time as well. So we'd encourage you to do that. But the recommending option is kind of new-ish. What we've created is very simply a bucket that admins can create called an admin recommended bucket. As the name implies, it's going to allow you to put things that you recommend into that bucket, so that when your users go into their environment, especially new users, but it can be any users, we can encourage them to look at what other people have shared already. Well, checking to see what the admin has recommended is probably going to be even a better place to start, because as an admin, you're probably recommending it for a reason. So it's just a way to draw their attention to, either new stuff, important stuff, good templates, whatever it might be in there. But that's something we've added recently, so we find it a little helpful. Now we're going to talk about, I'm kind of missing a slide in between, but that's okay. Now we're going to talk about some of those search optimization methods. So the first one we start with is partitions. Now we're going to talk about actually 3 or 4 different optimization methods. And I think I mentioned at the beginning of the call, some of them I'm going to encourage you to use right away. Some of them I just want you to understand what they do so that you know when to use them. And that first one is partitions. So what partitions allow you to do is, as I alluded to already a little bit, is they allow you to create indexes for subsets of your data. So by default, without using partitions, any data that's collected for Sumo Logic or is brought into Sumo Logic gets put into one big general index or one big bucket. And many other companies do it that way. It's not really unique. And so when you want to query against your data, your query would go to that bucket of data and kind of sort through it, sift through it, finds what it needs, and retrieves it. Pretty normal behavior. Well, what we've allowed you to do with partitions is create smaller, essentially indexes, so that you can place your data in there. And the benefit of doing that is that when you go ahead and query against that smaller set of data, your query is going to that smaller bucket of data. It has less data to sort through or sift through, and the query will return quicker. Now, what's quicker? Well, it could be a millisecond, but it will technically return faster. And it will be faster than just a millisecond of additional performance. But I don't want to give a specific number because it really varies on a lot of things. So where we can take these partitions is to create, particularly as we say here, between 1 to 30% of your total volume. So here we have some examples on the far right where you might create a partition for prod myapp1 versus prod myapp2, or maybe separate prod data versus dev data. Now, I did mention that we want to do this for between 1 to 30% of the total volume. And the reason we want to encourage that is because well, a few reasons, but one reason is it doesn't really make sense to have, let's say, 10 terabytes of data and then create a partition that's 9 terabytes, because you're not really gaining much. I mean, I guess you're gaining 10% or whatever in performance, but it's really not much of a difference. But we've really found where you use these smaller buckets of 1 to 30%, that's where we can, or you can really see a speed performance. So you'd want to group that data that's going to be searched together most often to place it in its own bucket. Now, another big benefit of partitions, which is newer for us, is the fact that you can customize your data retention. So now what you can do is you could say, my production data, I want to keep for 1 year, but my development data, I only want to keep for 30 days, or whatever you want to do. So you can set different retention periods, which can be helpful for many reasons. Legal reasons, you might not be able to keep data for a certain period. Cost, you just might want to dump data after a certain time. And now you can really, customize it, where previously it was essentially one hard rule that said I keep all data for X amount of time. Now you can really start to configure it. Field extraction rules. So hopefully you've seen these before, because these are really important. In fact, I say if you learn anything from today, hopefully more than 2 things, but the 2 things I want you to come away with are the importance of source categories and the importance of field extraction rules. So you probably have played with the field extraction rules before, but I just want to stress them again. As a reminder, what they allow you to do, or somebody in your organization to do, actually it doesn't have to be an administrator, is to parse the data when it comes into the system at the time of ingestion, rather than doing so at search time. And this provides a variety of different benefits. So the first benefit is it provides better performance, because since you have to have less queries, less lines in your query, excuse me. You don't have to have a parse statement in your query. Well, that's less lines. Query runs faster with less lines, and so it can save time. Kind of sarcastically said here, it saves milliseconds, but those do add up as you do bigger queries, longer queries. So it can help with that. It starts to standardize for field names, because when you create the field extraction, you or someone in your environment is saying, this is a URL, this is an IP address, this is a size, for example. Well, that provides standard naming, because you might call something an IP address, somebody on your team might call it an IP number, somebody else might refer to it as an IP, and if you're not standardizing it, you're now using 3 different terms for the same thing. And if you start to share queries, if I'm expecting to see the word IP and it says IP number, I might, well, hopefully not get confused, but it might not be consistent, and so we want to really stress that. And then it provides for simplified search. So for this example here, with that IP address example, which is showing a IP address that cannot exist. I assume we did that for example purposes. But what this allows you to do is, rather than parsing out the data in a query saying, okay, look for this pattern and call this an IP address and now show me where IP address equals whatever, I can right away in my first line say, just show me IP addresses that equal whatever, because the system already knows how to locate an IP address. So really great way to just make things, like it says, simpler. Best practices, well, these are probably always good best practices, building simple specific rules. And you're going to want to test these operations thoroughly. Now, testing is always important, of course, but the reason it's important here is, like with the source categories, the field extraction rules are not retroactive. So if I put a field extraction rule in right now, and I call something an IP, and I meant to call it an IP number, I can't retroactively change that. I can change it, but it will only impact data that gets ingested in the future or going forward. So, testing is always best, but sometimes it doesn't happen, but we'd encourage you to, or try to recommend that you can test those. Limitations, these are kind of, well, I guess I should mention them still. So there is a limitation of having 50 rules resulting in 200 fields. If you hit that limit, you can just contact our tech support team and just send them an email, and they will just bump it up. So eventually that limit will be removed from a hard code side, but right now it is still there. So we just have to manually modify it for you. But it's easy to do. It's free. It's just, it takes a very short amount of time. And then not all operators are supported. So, hopefully this is sort of obvious, but the field extraction rules aren't used for parsing. So you wouldn't want to create a field extraction rule, and you can't create a field extraction rule that has an outlier in it or has a count in it. It's just not the right place for it. So looks like we have a question. So let me go ahead and try and answer that. Would the field extraction rules reduce the amount of data that gets ingested against your gigabytes daily? No, not really. So basically the data is going to come in. At that point, it's been ingested, and then the first thing it does is then says, okay, I see that Apache data is being ingested. Let me label this portion of the Apache message as an IP address, this as a sorry, I'm spacing, status code. This is the date and time section, etc. So it's not going to allow you to modify the amount of data that comes in. It's just when that data comes in, it's now labeled properly, giving it field names essentially. So, all right, let's go ahead and continue. Let's see. Sorry, just gonna see if there's any more of that chat. Okay, cool. Scheduled views. So this is not a feature I'd encourage you to use right away, but I do want you to know what it is, because for the right use case, it really can be quite helpful. What this allows you to do, and the explanation I have on the screen is a little long-winded or confusing, actually, is probably a better word, so I'll just describe it. Basically, what this feature allows you to do is, rather than running a query by going into the system, clicking, entering your query, clicking start, doing it again and again, start, you can have the system run the query in the background. And so what you would do is you would take a query, you would save it as a scheduled view, and I'll show you the UI in a second, and I'll show you the UI for the field extraction rules as well. I should jump in there. And so what it allows you to do is say, I want this view, but it's really a query, to run every minute. And next time I want the results from that query, it would retrieve the previous minute's results. So where this is helpful is, let's say you have a query that's really long to run. It's a query that takes, I don't know, a long time to run. You can decide what long time is, but and you run it repetitively. So every morning, you come in and you have this query saved and you run it, and it takes a while, and then you get the results from it and you continue on with your work. Well, what you can do is you can take that query and save it as a scheduled view. And then instead of running the query, you would just run the view name. And by doing so, it's going to take that query that's been running, take the results from the last minute and populate them for you. So the results would be delayed by a minute, but it's also going to run a lot faster. So it's a little bit of a trade-off. Let's go ahead and let me see. Do I have one more? Yeah, let me go into the UI now just to show those couple of things. Okay. So these are going to be found under administration, under managed data, under settings. And I'm going to skip over some of the settings because some of these are new, really new, where we haven't even finished documentation on them. So fields I'm going to skip over. It's going to be a helpful feature in the future, but for now I'm going to skip over it. But field extraction rules, let's go ahead and show and talk about. And it looks like someone's been making a bunch in here. So the way they work, I'm going to create one from scratch because I think it just illustrates the functionality of it. So I'm going to go ahead and first give the rule name. So I'm just going to give it a, an English name, or doesn't have to be English, but just a kind of a common name. So I'm just going to call it, I'm going to do this for Apache, we usually do. So I'm going to call it Apache FER, and I'm going to give it a number because I've done this, a few times. Now I need to provide the scope, and the scope is what data do I want this rule to apply to? So this is where I can use a source category to my advantage. So I can say source category equals labs/Apache/access because I want this to apply to my Apache data. But here I can also use a wildcard because my lab Apache data and my prod Apache data are still going to be in the same format, or should be. And so what I could do is say, you know what, apply this to all my Apache access data. So just, whatever you want to do. Now here's where you have to provide a parse expression. So here's where you need to tell the system when data from Apache data comes in, label this as an IP address, this is a status code, this is a URL, etc. Now you can create your own parse expression, which is, if you can, that's great. We'd encourage you to do so, but we want to make it a little bit easier for you. And so what we created are templates for the top 15 or 20 different file formats. And if you want to use one, you just click on it. So we wanted to bring in those Apache access logs. Now we have a little template here. Now we're just going to say use template. And now we can customize the template. So what we're saying here with this first line is we're saying when you get an Apache access message, look for number.number.number.number and call that a source IP. Well, you know what? Maybe source IP is not common terminology in my organization. Maybe I just want to call it an IP. Well, I just did. And now I click add. And now going forward from essentially this point forward, any data that comes in that that's associated with the source category of Apache access will have the field extraction rule apply to it, and the system will say this is an IP, this is a URL, this is a status code, and so on and so forth. So really helpful. Partitions, so this is where it is set up, and this is how it's set up. It's really kind of easy. Very simply, give the partition a name, which is going to be an English, or once again, it doesn't have to be English, but a name, and then a routing expression. So Apache, although I already have Apache one. So, and then so once again, source category, and spelling it correctly helps, lab/Apache/access. Now, before you click submit, this is where you can adjust the retention period if you want to modify it from the current one. So I can go ahead and say, you know what, this data I only want to keep for 3 days for whatever reason. And another thing I can do right here is enable data forwarding. So what this allows me to do is forward data to an S3 bucket. So essentially when data is collected and enters the partition, I can also say send that data also to S3. And the reason we do that is really to help you with cost, because housing data in Sumo is expensive. I mean, relatively, it's of course a great product that's worth every penny, but it can be expensive. And so what we encourage you to do is bring the data you need to analyze, bring that into Sumo Logic, but at the same time forward that data to another environment, so at least it's copied over there in S3 if you ever need it. So if a year from now you realize, oh, you know what, I needed September's data, we don't want you to keep a year's data in Sumo if you don't need it. So that way you could just go to the S3 bucket, grab that data, forward it in or ingest it into Sumo Logic using a hosted collector, and now you have access to that data. So just want to give you help and ways to improve your situation, which certainly data forwarding can help with cost. It also gives you kind of almost a backup of your data as well, which many customers like. And then scheduled views is the last portion I'll show in here. Maybe I'll show a few more actually. So scheduled views, let's see, I have one here. I don't have a great example, but it's good enough. So here, for example, I created my query. So if I take my query, I can always run my query, like normal. There's my query, I run it, it takes X amount of time and it returns. Now this is a very simple query, so it will return quickly. But what I can do if I had one that was a little more advanced is I can save it as a scheduled view. And now what I can do is take the scheduled view name, and now instead of doing, actually I'll do it in here, instead of doing the query itself, I would just say view equals, and now it's going to take that query that it ran a minute ago and bring those results back to me. So just a way to improve performance a little bit. Not something I'd encourage you to jump in and start using like right away, but it's there for you. And then you can also set retention periods as well for that. So retain the data as long as you want. Metrics rules I'm going to skip over for now. We're not really doing much with metrics in this class. We have a separate one that really digs deeper. So I'm going to skip it for now. Connections, though, I'll show. I haven't gone over it in a slide, but just I'm in the interface. I might as well talk about it. So connections is where you will be able to set up different communication connections with us or allow us to communicate with you. So if you want to get alerts via Slack, this is where you would set up that Slack configuration. Any webhooks, Slack, Twitter, Discord, whatever it might be. And then data forwarding, this is where you would set up that data forwarding. So this is where you would say, all right, I want to have a bucket in S3. Here's the bucket I'm setting up, and anytime data gets forwarded, send that data to that bucket. And you just fill out the access key, security key, security stuff really. All right, cool. Let's go ahead and jump back into the slide deck, and let me start with the slide deck, and then I'll probably jump just directly into the interface for this rest. So now I want to talk about some administrative features. So these are going to be things that previously, it's all administration. You're here for administration, but the first half was more administration around collecting data, really fully data collection, or at least organizing your data with source categories. These next things are administration more around security policies, password policies, RBAC, things like that. So still administration, just different a little bit. So what I want to show in here is starting with an account overview. And you know what? I think I'm just going to go straight into the UI for most of this. So I wanted to start on administration. Let's see, my mouse is being a little weird. Okay, cool. Oh, there we go. Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. I think it's my Wi-Fi here is a little sluggish. So under administration, under account, the first option is account overview. And it's exactly what it sounds like. It's an overview of the account. So what this allows you to do is see information about your billing period and how much you're ingesting, and some basic graphical information about usage. Now I'm going to show you a better way to do this or view this information, but this is one way. So if you want to get a quick kind of static, well, it's not static, it's dynamic page, but this is a good place to check for it. Now, data management, this is where I'm going to encourage you to, what is this going? That's weird, sorry about that. Is data volume. So by checking this box, and I believe it's unchecked by default, I can't recall, so I apologize for that, but I believe it's unchecked. So what you would do is you would check this box. And by doing so, what it allows you or us to do is to enable data volume tracking. And where this is going to be helpful is that you can use the data volume app to view your data volume usage. So let's go ahead and take a look at that now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the app catalog, and there's going to be an app called Data Volume. There it is. I'm going to click on it. And I'm very simply just going to add to library. When I do, I'm going to need to give the app a name. In reality, you probably won't, but I'm going to need to just put a name just because I've installed this app before. And I'm going to click Add to Library. At this point, the data volume data is being taken. The data volume app is taking queries and dashboards, or really specifically, actually it does have both, and putting the two together. So now if I was to go to my data volume overview, this is now going to show me similar information as I saw under account overview, but much more detailed. So here, for example, it's going to start with log ingestion. So it's going to show us how much is being ingested each day. What is collecting all this data? What are the source categories for that data? And then metrics information. And where this is helpful, if it's not obvious, is many customers come to us and say, hey, I'm ingesting X amount of data. Well, I don't really know what I'm ingesting it from. Can you tell me? And we created this so you could tell yourself, essentially. So another, let's go back to the data volume app. Another one that's helpful is, I mean, they all are, of course. Let's do logs. So now we're looking specifically at log information. And what this is going to show us is information about the data that's being collected, but it's going to show us trends as well as predictions for trends. So here we see ingestion spikes that have occurred. You know, if an ingestion spike occurs, you probably want to know about it, either because eventually going to be billed for it, but you probably want to know, you know, is it supposed to happen, or is the process gone wrong, or what? And so this is a way to view that. Outliers for the ingestion. Predictions as well. Now, in this case, we have a very static lab environment, so the data is kind of replicated, so it's not really going to show us too much in kind of variety or variability. But you can see, you know, it's showing us we're going to continue on. So this is a great way for you or potentially a billing person to see what's being used and then decide, you know, this is how we're going to internally, you know, handle billing for it. All right. So that is data volume. Let's go back to, that's really about it in the account. Upgrade, I'll ignore. Let's go into, I'm going to go to security first. Now with security, this is going to be, you know, pretty typical security stuff. But I'll go through it, not one by one, but just at a higher level. So password policy, this is where you can set a password policy. We'd encourage you to use a corporate policy if you have one. If you don't, using our defaults is probably good enough, or you can set your own. Ultimately, though, to be honest, as we'll get to in SAML, we'd really encourage your users to use SSO so that it makes it even easier for them so they don't have to remember a Sumo Logic password. You have the ability to enable or require two-step verification. So if you want them to get a PIN code, you know, to their cell phone that they have to enter in additional to the password, that type of thing, you can force that. Users also have the ability, if you choose not to force it, they can actually force it on themselves. So we've seen some of the more security conscious people will enable it for themselves, even if the organization's not using it, which, you know, that's probably good policy, but I'll let you dictate your own security policies. Service whitelisting settings. So what this allows you to do is whitelist some IPs or CIDR ranges, and CIDR ranges are groups of IPs if you're not familiar with them. And you can whitelist them in 2 or actually 3 different ways, kind of 2/3 ways. The first way you can do is for logins and or API, well, it's and APIs, it's really both. So with this, what you can say is, I only want people that are coming from this IP or this IP range to be able to log into Sumo Logic. If not coming from my corporate office, I don't want them to be able to log in. Or use the API, so you have that control. And then you also have the option to enable the dashboard whitelisting settings. So as you may have seen before, I'll show it actually, it actually occurs under the policy screens. You have the ability as a company to decide, do you want to have people share dashboards with the external world and not have them use a username and password to get those. Essentially, you can provide them a URL or a link that they click on and they can view that dashboard without needing to log in. Now that may have some security concerns. It may not. It's, you know, I certainly see why it could, of course. And so what we did is to help control that is you could whitelist. So you could say, I am not going to allow anybody in the world to get that link and use it, but if they're coming from my corporate office or my partner's office or a vendor in, you know, San Francisco, they can view that link without needing an access or ID or even a login or password. So it can be helpful in the right scenario. So we want to be able to give you controls to control it. So this is how you can do so. Access keys. So access keys, access ID is not really new, but Sumo Logic uses them. And we use them as a supplement or complement, I guess, to username and passwords. So access keys and IDs are a pair. They're used for authentication. The 2 places they're used primarily are with the API and then with the collector. And the reason we use these is by not using these methods, if you were to install a collector using your own username and password, well, what happens if your password changes? What happens if you leave the organization and your account is locked out or, delete it? Well, that's going to be a problem. And so these keys can still persist even after a user has logged in, because they're not really associated necessarily with the user themselves, just more anybody can create one and use it, but you can still disable a user's account and still keep the keys running if you want to. So this is just a better way to handle that. And if I have time, actually I do have time, I might even do a quick run through of that. Yeah, I probably will. All right, policies. There's 3 policies on this screen. I believe all of these are unchecked by default, but let's go through each one. Now, the first one is Sumo Logic Auditing. And what this is it's going to allow us or you to enable audit records for the account. So in a similar way that the data volume option allows us to capture data volume information, this allows us to capture audit records. And so by enabling this, the records start to be captured. And a way for you to easily access those records is to use the app catalog. So what you can do is you can go to the app catalog, you can look for the audit app, and here it is. You can add to library, give it a name. And now what you'll have access to is to see audit information about what your users are doing. So let's look at, I don't know, they're all fine. Account management overview is always a good place to start. So now what it's going to show me are the user operations, what's occurred, recent admin activities. This is showing that I created that volume quota. It's showing, this is a lab environment, so there's not a ton of activity in here, but it starts to show us these things that have occurred. It's also going to show us, yeah, actually I haven't done this recently, so there's no data in there. Let's choose another one that might be a little, have a little more data. Let's use, this is a good one. User activity. So now I can see what users are logging in from last successful login. I can see where they're logging in. So this map will populate shortly to show me where in the world my users are logging in. So in this case, I was just doing a training in Austin yesterday. And so this is showing that, I logged in and the team did as well. So I had one login and there might be a few more people logged in. Now where this map is also going to be helpful is to show you where people are logging in, both good and bad. So if you were to see somebody log in from Russia or China or North Korea, well, that might be kind of concerning. And so with this map and with this information, now you can see who's logging in from that location and decide is a security event. So if you see Bob, logged in from Russia, well, that might be okay. He might be there doing work or testing something or whatever. But if he's on vacation, well, that's probably concerning. Why is someone logging in from there where, he's not there? So you can start to dig into that. Looks like there are questions. Let me go ahead and help try and answer it. I need to modify my screen to look at questions. Let's see. Sorry about that. Yes, so the recording's gonna be posted. What we'll be doing is I'll send you a link at the end of this call that has a link to the slides and a recording as well. So you'll get all this later. All right, so that's the benefit of the auditing option. So we'd encourage you to turn this on, because if you don't, what has happened is customers will come to us and say, hey, I think somebody was doing something malicious, or just that they shouldn't have, searching data that they shouldn't have, or what have you. And if we're not capturing those audit records, it's kind of hard for us to tell you what the users are doing. So this is something I'd encourage you to turn on right away. And hopefully you never need it. Hopefully you never have a security event that you need to dig into. But if you do, at least we're capturing that data for you, and then you can do your detective work against it. This middle option here, support account access. It kind of does what it sounds like. But what this is a helpful feature is for us at Sumo. So what this is going to allow you to do is by not using this option or not checking this option, what you can do is, let's see, how does I describe this? If you do not check this option, we don't have the ability, our support team does not have the ability to really look directly at your account. So they can look at some things. So, I mean, we do have access to look at some queries and stuff like that. But when you check this, what it allows them to do is basically log in as almost as you or as a user in your organization, and they can actually see what queries you've shared, what your settings are for, all these different things, where without that, they can't really see it. It really gives them like an apples to apples view. It's almost like a Zoom, but, them logging in with their own information. So this is only, used by a couple people in our organization, I think 4 people maybe are vetted to use it, and they go through security clearance and all that. And so this is something we'd encourage you to turn on because it makes their job a lot easier and makes assisting you a lot easier. Now you might say, well, I'm not comfortable enabling that because I don't want people at Sumo looking into my account, and that's legitimate, of course. So what we encourage you to do is know where this option is. If you don't want to enable it, great. When you contact our support team, they'll ask you to enable it to have us be able to look into your account. If you don't want to enable it for that point, you don't have to. Of course, it's going to make things harder. What I'd encourage you to do, though, is enable it. Let this admin or the tech support person work with you. Once they're done, you go ahead and just disable this, and then that kills that account that they were using. So why don't you just know where it is? I'd encourage people to use it. If you don't want to leave it on all the time, totally understand. Just know where it is for when you contact support. And this last option here I talked about, but this is where it's actually controlled, is the sharing dashboards outside the organization. So very simply, do you as an admin want to let people share things outside the organization without using a username and password? Yes or no? If you say yes, you can still implement the whitelisting or under the surface whitelisting settings, or you might just decide, I only want people to access dashboards in Sumo Logic that have a login, and then you would uncheck that. And like I said, I believe it's unchecked by default. And then the last option in here is SAML. So if you're using SSO, we'd encourage you to use it for Sumo. It's just going to make your users' lives easier to get into Sumo, which is good. Always encouraged. All right, let's go ahead and talk about users and roles. So users and roles go together. We have RBAC. So you have the ability to add a user, and adding a user is really pretty simple. You can provide the first name, last name, and an email address so that we can send the user their password. And then you're going to just tell us what roles you want them to have assigned to. And the roles allow you to start to customize what the user can do. So let's go ahead and look at the roles themselves. So here, which one? I don't know. It doesn't really matter which one I choose. Let's use the Apache only one I created. So what I've done with this role is I first said what filter, if any, they are limited to do. So what I'm saying here is people that have the Apache only role can only access lab Apache data. They can't access prod Apache data. They can't access lab Bo365 data. They're really segmented to what they can do. Now, you may not want to give this granularity. You may want to do it for some of them, up to you. And then you have the capability. So this is where you'll define what can the user do that has the Apache only role within Sumo. Can they manage connections? Can they manage collectors? And so on and so forth. And you would just decide, what's appropriate. By default, we do create 2 roles automatically, and that's an administrator role and an analyst role. An administrator role is kind of what it sounds like. It's a power user, God user almost, that can do everything. The analyst role is somebody that can, they're limited to what they can do. They can search data. They can't do anything with the collectors, with the users, but they can do it against any data they want. So it's kind of wide open. And then from there, we just encourage you to, create your own, fine tune them. So, if you want to create one where somebody can only view collectors, create that role. Ideally, creating it associated with a job function is usually best, but can be whatever you want. Really, that's about it for users and roles. So let's go ahead and take a look at the collections, because we haven't really, at least in the UI. So what I'm going to do is go to collection, and there we go. So when I go to collection, what I see are all my collectors. These are all the collectors that have been configured, and it gives me a status of them. So let's look at, I use Apache all the time, so I'm just going to go specifically that one again. It's just like using that example. So here, when I search for Apache, I'm saying, show me all the different collectors or different sources of data that are being ingested that have Apache data. And so I'm going to pinpoint this one here. What this one is showing me is this is lab Apache data. It's showing me that it's a hosted collector. So what it's telling me is that, and I should know this if I set it up, but it's telling me that this is a collector that is being hosted by Sumo Logic versus one that's installed on almost a physical piece of hardware. It's letting me know some graphical information. So this is showing me a chart of how much data, or kind of a status of data, I guess, if you will, over the last hour. So I see it's going up and down, which is good because it means data is coming in at least. And then it's letting me know how many log messages have occurred or have been found with this data over the last hour, which is just about 250,000. Now down below here, it's showing me the source categories that I'm starting to apply to my data. So here, this is saying any data that's coming in via this collector have the Lab Apache Access source category applied to it. If it's this type of data, Apache error data, have the Apache error source category applied to it, and so on. Whoops, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to click on that. So what I want to do now, let's see, there's a question. Let me just see. Hold on, let me just get the questions. Okay, the question about the recording, so that's a popular question. We'll be sending a link that has links to both this recording and a few other recordings for other sessions. So we'll lead you to a web page that has everything. So good to see you guys are interested in listening to this again. And certainly feel free to give that recording to your peers or whomever. But what I want to do now is I want to install a collector. And let me go ahead and, let me just do it. So I'm going to go ahead and add a collector. When I add a collector, I am first going to decide, as I showed earlier, what type of collector do I want to do? Do I want to do an installed collector or a hosted collector? I'm going to start with an installed collector, but I will show the hosted collector as well. Actually, while the installed collector is downloading, I'll probably show the hosted collector. So I'm going to choose installed collector. And now I'm just going to choose the OS I'm using. So I'm going to choose Mac OS because that's what I'm on. Now the collector is going to start to be downloaded. So I'm going to let it download. It's actually just about done. But then I'll install that collector. So that's going to be the installed collector path that I'll take you down. But while I'm in this section, let's go ahead and take a look at a hosted collector just quickly. I would go to add collector and I would choose hosted collector. And then very simply, I'm going to fill in this information. So I'm going to do this as a test. I'm going to do JB host, my initials. And then I'm going to give this a source category if I want to. Actually, I'm going to skip it here. I'm just going to click save. And now I'm going to choose where that cloud data resides. So is this S3 data? Is it GCP data? Is it CloudTrail data? You know, all these different cloud properties. I'll click one, let's say CloudTrail for now. And now here is where I would fill in the information. So here I would put the bucket name, the path expression to locate that data. The source category. So this is where I might say, call this source category labs/AWS/CloudTrail, maybe /JB because it's just the project I'm working on. And then here's where I would put the access. So this is where I would put that key information. And then the frequency, and then we would start to go ahead and grab those logs on your behalf. So that's setting up the hosted collector. The installed collector is basically the same, it's just more steps because it has to be installed somewhere. We have to run the executable. We have to put the access key and ID, but let me show you how to do it. So I'm going to go ahead and let's start to install the collector. So I'm going to open up the app. Now the other thing I'm going to need to do here, let's go ahead and get that starting to install. It's going to take a moment on my machine. I have some security stuff. Yep. So I'm going to have to log in. Okay. Now what I wanted to show is at the same time that we start to install the collector, we're going to need to set up, sorry that keeps flipping back and forth. Let's see, how can I avoid that? Let's see if I do this. Okay. Let me just try and clean this up real fast. Sorry about this. Come on. There we go. Okay. So the collector is starting to install. I need to enter these credentials just because it's my laptop is locked down. But what I'm going to do while the correctly. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go back into the interface and I'm going to create a security access key and ID. I have a few different ways to do it. I'm going to create it through preferences. And I'm going to go ahead and make the screen a little bigger, and I'm going to click add. When I do, I'm going to give the key a name. So, just a label for it. So I'm going to call it JB laptop. And then I'm going to click create key. When I do, this is the only time that I will be provided with the access key and the ID. Actually, I take that back. The ID shows up other places. The key doesn't. So this is where you're going to save these credentials or use these credentials to install the collector. So I'm going to have to cut and paste or copy these into the collector installation, which I'll show you how to do. I mean, it's pretty easy to do, of course, but I'll show those steps. If you, some organizations require that keys and IDs like this need to be stored in like a locker environment, this would be the time to also go ahead and put those in that locker because you won't see these again. So let's go into the collector installation. The first part of the installation is like any other, executable. License agreement, accept it blindly. Where do you want to install the collector? Directory. It's now going to install. Now at this point, it's installing the collector. It's not establishing the connection to Sumo Logic. We're going to do that in a second. So right now it's just installing that executable. Now here, we could modify these settings. I'm not going to, but if we did want to change the collector name, it's going to use the computer name by default. And this is where, as I mentioned earlier, can become troublesome if you have computer 4421 and 4422. It's not going to be a clear name for the collector. You can also do, proxy things. So if you need a proxy to get out or something like that, you can set that up in here, but we're not going to do that. So I'm just going to next that. And here's where I'm going to use the option of the access key. And now I'm going to take that ID and key pair and paste them in. So now I'm going to go grab that copy, that ID, paste it in, grab that key, paste it in. And now I'm going to click next. And when I do, the system is now, as it says here, is going to try to connect to Sumo Logic. So it's going to use that key and ID to dial home, essentially. If it's able to, it will show confirmation as it does right now. If it's not able to, it will present essentially an error message. Why do you get the error message? Well, I mean, can be many reasons, but the more common ones are you copied the key or ID incorrectly or put them in the wrong spot, which is much more common than you would think. Or maybe you just, you're installing this on a location where maybe your firewall is not open to allow Sumo Logic to connect to, or you to connect to Sumo Logic. So, and those can all be handled by whitelisting, but usually it's pretty seamless. So now I'm going to click finish. I'm done with this key, so I don't need it anymore. Now, one thing I'm going to do here, and this is where I'll encourage you to do this later, is if you go home, go to learn. These are the steps I'm going to do right now, is this hands-on labs administration. But I'm not going to have us do it as a group, just it gets a little unwieldy with so many people dialed in. But I will go through the steps. So, and I'd encourage you to do these later. And what I'm going to do right now for this step is I'm going to grab a source of data. So here is a file that I've created that is Apache Access Logs. It's just demo data. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to download this to my device, my laptop. Because now I have, in this scenario, I have data in my environment, in this case, my laptop, and I want to bring it into Sumo Logic. I have the collector installed, but now we need to go further and actually have the data moved into Sumo Logic. So now let's go through those steps. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back home and go to Manage Data and Collection. But now if I go ahead and search for my collector name, I should see it. And what I'm seeing here is there's a collector called JBrothheim Mac. I see, even if I mouse over at who created it, which was me, of course. I see the type of collector and I see the status. And then I don't see anything under here or to the right of here. And the reason I don't is because I haven't told the system to bring in any data. What the green check is representing is very simply that the system is able to ping pong back and forth with the collector. If it was not able to, we would get a red X. So green check mark means the collector is alive, but it doesn't mean data is being transferred back and forth. In this case, there's no data being transferred back and forth because we haven't told it what data to grab. And now we need to do that. So now let's go ahead and do those steps. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a source of data. What type of source data do we want to add? Do we want to add metrics? Do we want to add logs? Well, we want to do logs, and in this case, we want to do a local file. The reason we want to do a local file is because we want to do a file that's local to where the collector is installed. So since the collector is installed where the text file that I downloaded is, they're both local to each other. Now I'm going to go ahead and fill in the blanks. So I'm going to give this a name. So, what do I want to call this? Well, not very creative, Apache log data. I need to give a file path. So where is this data located? So what I can do here is there's many ways to handle this, but I can go to my Finder, go to my file I just downloaded, go ahead and grab the location of that file. So I need the path name. I'm going to paste that path name in. And then I'm going to fill in some of these blanks. So when do I want collection to begin? Should it start previously? Should it start now? How far back do we want to go? What source category do I want to use? So this might be where I say labs, lab/Apache/JB. And I'm going to copy that because I won't remember what I used. And then I have some other settings. So what I can do here is I specified a specific file, but I could specify a directory. And what I can do here with the blacklist is I could say, all right, grab anything from the downloads directory except text files or except log files or whatever. I can start with blacklist and start to exclude data in directories that I don't want to bring in. I can set time zones, which are going to be very important. When this data gets ingested, what time zone do I want to use? Do I want to use the time zone where the collector is installed? Do I want to use Pacific time because that's where our headquarters is? I have many options. So pick one. Timestamp. We can automatically detect the format on, it's quite a long list. It's almost like 300 different timestamp formats. So if it's a even remotely common format, we can detect it. But maybe you have some really weird format. You have year, day, hour, month, something weird. You can specify that format in here. There we go, turn it off. And then the last thing I'll show in here is processing rules. And somebody asked about excluding data, and this is a way to handle it. So what I can do with these processing rules is I can create a rule via filter, via regex or regular expression, that can exclude certain type of messages or hash certain type of messages or mask them. So that if I, let's say I'm ingesting data and I don't want to bring in any PII, personal information data into Sumo Logic, which we don't want you to bring in either, name, credit card numbers, things like that. You could say, if it has a social security number, it matches the pattern number, exclude it or hash it or mask it, or, the options are, I was going to say endless. I mean, there's 6 of them, 5 of them, but you do have options. All right, so now I'm going to go ahead and click apply. Oh, yeah, I'm not doing the processing rule, so I can just click save rather, excuse me. So now when I click save, what's happening is those instructions that I put in, essentially, or the blanks I filled in, are being sent to the collector. So now those instructions are being sent from the Sumo Logic cloud to my laptop. And now if I go back to my collection screen and refresh this, I should start to see data coming in. Now it's going to take a few seconds. Let's see. But I should even be able to query against it. So let's go ahead and now search against Lab Apache's JB data. So now if I go ahead and do source category equals lab. Oh, let me change the time. Yeah. So if all good properly, and come on, I don't know. I'm probably at a typo somewhere. Oh, that's a shame. I apologize for that. Kind of ruined the big reveal. Oh, no, there it is. It just took a moment to come in. Let's try this one more time. Sorry for that loud surprise that it was there. So where is it? Sorry for waiting here, but all right, it is in there. I'll show it later. I don't know why it's not popping up in the query. I imagine I was just doing a typo, Labs. Let's go on one more time. The reason I'm choosing last 24 hours is the data I have is not for a full day. It's from like 3 a.m. to 4 a.m. So I need to choose a wider range. Yeah, I'm not quite sure why it's not showing up yet, but I'll check in a few moments. I don't want to tie up the call just waiting for me to correct the typo. But what I do want to do next is show the host metrics. So what I'm going to do is go back to my collector. So now, right now, I'm collecting data from my laptop, my Apache data, hopefully. It shows I'm grabbing it, so it should be queryable. But what I can also do is grab host metrics. So let's say I want to grab CPU information and network and memory usage on my laptop or of my laptop. To do so, I'm going to go to add, and I'm going to choose source again. Remember, these instructions are going to be sent to the collector. So now I can choose host metrics. And now I'm going to essentially start to fill in the blanks again. So I'm going to call this JB host metrics. I'm going to give it a source category called JB host. I don't need to tell the system where the data is because the system or the collector already knows how to retrieve CPU usage and those type of metrics. So even easier to do. I'm going to choose a scanner interval. How frequently do I want this information to be scanned for? Well, the more frequent you do, the more data is going to come in. So I'm going to choose more frequent just so I can get data in quicker. I don't want to wait 5 minutes, so I'm going to choose 10 seconds. And then I would choose the type of metrics I want to bring in. Do I want to bring in CPU usage? And I have all these sub CPU, things. um, you may know what some of these are. We have a little description on them, but CPU load average for 1 minute, 5 minutes, so on and so forth. Memory, TCP, network, all this stuff. I'm just going to check really all of them just to get some data in, and I'm going to click save. Now, once again, the data, the instructions are going to the collector, which is on my laptop, and then the collector now knows, hey, look for that Apache log data, but also look for that host metric data as well. Now, if I go back to collection, I now see 2 things going on here. And now if I go ahead and do a metric search for my host metrics, I start to see them populate. So now I'm starting to see those metrics. I'll do this just to get, just to make the screen, sorry, I can't type. My mouse isn't typing. It's not been a good morning. Here we go. So now I can start to see my disk used and all these other informations for metrics that might be helpful. I'm going to go back to that other query real fast. Let's see if those logs started to show up, because they really should have. Yeah, there they go. Okay, so just as being a little sluggish. This is a lab environment or a training environment, so it is a production environment, but it's also a little slow sometimes too. So, and so that's how you can take your data, collect it, bring it into Sumo Logic, and now start to analyze it. So that really covers the components that I wanted to discuss today. We're a little ahead of schedule, which I don't think anyone will mind. So I'll go ahead and open it up to questions. Let's see, I don't see any. As discussed a couple times, the recordings will be provided. So it's good that you guys are eager to get those. So what I'd suggest, what you're going to want to do here is log in with your Sumo Logic account. If you don't have one, or if it's not working or you have any problem, just and under administration, you'll take the exam. Now the prep is twofold. We have the setting up Sumo webinar, which was the portion I did just now, talking and all that. And then we have the tutorial, which are the steps that I showed, but which I would encourage you to do. But like I mentioned, the steps are not required in order for you to take the exam or even pass the exam. It's okay to do them out of order. So what I encourage you to do is take the exam now. As a reminder, the exam is open book, open resource, open Google, open help. It's just meant for you to show that you can use Sumo Logic and the help documentation to resolve your issues. It's 30 questions, multiple choice. So if you take an exam before with us, it's the same rules. You have 3 times to take it. If you need more, you can just go ahead and give us a shout. But that's really going to conclude for today. So I will leave the channel open. So I'll put myself on mute. If there are any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. And I'll leave the channel open for about an hour or so. But otherwise, I'll follow up with an email. Probably later today. I'll try to do it shortly. But yeah, thank you for attending, and hope you found this helpful. We certainly would invite you to some of our other classes. So security analytics, I think we're doing later today. I might be doing it in about an hour or 2. Can't remember. And then we have some new classes. We haven't started to do online classes for these yet for metrics with Kubernetes, Cloud SIM, or metrics mastery, but we will be pretty soon. I need to start to schedule those. So keep an eye out for the registration page where you signed up for these virtual cert jams, and you can go ahead and register for those if they're applicable. We'd certainly like to have you. So once again, I'll shut up now. I'll give you some time to take the exam, but thank you for attending, and good luck.